So, welcome to this week's lecture, A Brief History of Education in the U.S. We're going to be talking about many different events that happened to build the educational system that we have in the United States and that hopefully you'll one day teach in. Um, a hypertext timeline has many more things, and I've listed the resource in your reading and videos folder this week if you want to explore some of these things in more depth. So the first question before we get into details is, why should we even learn about this? Well, you're about to enter a long and impressive and storied field. And I think it's really neglectful if you don't know at least a little bit about something, how it got to be the way it is now. Also, understanding our past can help shape our future. There were mistakes made, there were victories. We should know that so we can take advantage of it. And finally, there were things that were done that shaped or affected you personally, both as a student and in the future as a teacher. So for the early days, we're going back to the 17th century, and we're going all the way back to 1607, when the first permanent English settlement was founded at Jamestown, Virginia. In 1620, Plymouth was founded, so the Pilgrims and the Puritans, you know that story. It wasn't much later, 1635, that the first Latin grammar school was founded. Now, grammar schools, when we say grammar schools today, we think about elementary schools, but these were primarily for older students. They were for all white male students, usually of wealthy landed folks who wanted to send their sons off for a classic education in Latin and Greek for the purpose of joining the clergy. Don't forget that in a very new place like this, parents would have been anxious that their sons would not have been educated properly. So there were some of these grammar schools that were founded. The first ones were founded in and around Massachusetts. Girls were not educated, or at least not outside the home. They were primarily educated to do sewing and domestic crafts in the home. In 1636, Harvard was founded in Cambridge. So Harvard is our oldest college in the United States. Between 1642 and 1646, Massachusetts began, remember it wasn't a state, it was a colony, began to pass laws requiring that each town of 100 persons or more have a schoolmaster or a school teacher. Before that, there were no requirements, no legal laws. In 1693, the College of William and Mary was founded in Virginia. And so the College of William and Mary became the second college in the United States. And Thomas Jefferson actually went to the College of William and Mary. Now, certain things happened that caused our ideas about education to start to change. In 1787, after the Revolutionary War was fought and won, the Constitutional Convention happened, and the Constitution was ratified in 1788. The Northwest Ordinance passed also in 1787, which basically banned slavery from the northern states, left it alone in the southern states. That was sort of the compromise that the colonies came to when they couldn't agree on the issue of slavery. And then in 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified. And so you might remember these as amendments to the Constitution, the First Amendments, and these were amendments that gave rights. So the First Amendment, for example, ensured that we had freedom of speech. And the 10th Amendment gave the states all the powers not delegated to the federal government. Now, there is nothing in the Constitution about education. Sorry, a plane is going overhead and I'm outside. There's nothing about in the Constitution about education. And because it wasn't specifically delegated to the federal government, it fell to the states. So that's why now we have state control over education instead of federal government. Because of these and other issues, people started thinking about education differently. And the first thing they said is, well, you know what? Maybe we don't want to have just Latin and Greek and a very classical curriculum. Maybe we should start to expand what we teach. So between 1710 and 1770, religious groups, particularly in the middle colonies such as Pennsylvania, that were dominated by groups such as the Mennonites and the Quakers, began to establish schools, and schools for that weren't grammar schools, schools that taught an expanded curriculum, and perhaps schools that allowed, again, all males, but boys who may not have been from wealthy family, not destined to the clergy, to attend. In 1743, Benjamin Franklin formed the American Philosophical Society, which brought ideas of the Enlightenment to colonial America. And so I don't know how much you remember about your study of history, but the Enlightenment was a set of ideas that moved over from Europe that said basically that men are created equal and they deserve an education and they deserve to be quote unquote enlightened. So study became a good thing. Franklin saw it and some of his peers saw it as a very good thing, and a way that we should and a tool that democracies should be using. In 1751, Franklin and others established the English Academy, which expanded the curriculum to include history, geography, and more. So instead of just studying the classical languages, Latin and grammar, for example, they expanded the curriculum. Of course, the Revolutionary War took place in 1775 to 1783. And after the war and the Constitutional Convention that we talked about, you had certain developments. Noah Webster, you might know his name. It's famous because he also developed a dictionary, but he also wrote a Grammatical Institute of the English Language, a spelling, grammar, and a reader. And this book has never been out of print. In 1836, McGuffey's curriculum was published. Before this time, readings had mostly been religious in nature, readings from the Bible, stories about the Bible. Now there were more secular readings that were starting to come out. In the late 18th and throughout the 19th centuries, you had a movement to push for education for more people, the rise of education for all. So, for example, the first girls' school was founded in 1787. That was the Young Ladies Academy in Philadelphia. In 1823, Catherine Beecher, who was the sister to writer Harriet Beecher Stowe, um, founded Harvard Private Seminary for Girls in Connecticut. In 1837, Mount Holyoke became the first college for women in Massachusetts. And 1837, Oberlin College became the first coeducational college where men and women studied together. In 1837 also, you had the founding of the African Institute in Pennsylvania, the first formal academy of learning for Black Americans. Elizabeth Blackwell became the first woman to graduate with a medical degree from Geneva Medical College. And in 1879, the first Indian boarding school opened in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It became the model for a total of 26 similar schools, all with the goal of assimilating Indian children into the mainstream culture. The schools left a controversial legacy. Some people feel like today they were attempting to wipe out the Native Americans' own culture and replace it with the white culture. But this is an example of how education became not just for rich white males destined for the clergy, but was pushed out into these other groups. Most people associate the rise of special education with the 20th century and some of the laws that we'll talk about later. But in reality, you had the rise of special education from the 19th century. In 1817, the first deaf school was founded in Hartford, Connecticut by Thomas Gallaudet. You might know that name because his son eventually went on to found Gallaudet University, the first university for deaf students. In 1829, the New England Asylum for the Blind came about, and in 1853, Pennsylvania began funding the Pennsylvania Training School for Feeble-Minded Children, a private school for children with intellectual disabilities. Sometimes when you read the way some of these children were described, it will shock you. Um, and so just remember you're talking about a term that was accepted at the time, not something we accept today, feeble-minded children. Today we would call those students with disabilities. There also came about the rise of more or higher education. Remember, until this point, many children, many boys, went to school only for a short time, and it was very typical for them to drop out somewhere between what we would consider the 5th and the 8th grade. The country was still primarily rural, and so these children would have been needed on the farm to help with crops. And so after about the 5th to the 8th grade, when they had learned to read or do some basic math, their parents would have likely pulled them to help around the farm. But in the 19th century, you had the rise of high schools. In 1821, the Boston English High School opened, one of the first public high schools. And in 1827, Massachusetts became the first state that passed a law requiring that the state offer public high schooling. It wasn't still mandatory, it wasn't yet mandatory, but at least that it be offered. Now in 1892, the National Education Association formed a group called the Committee of 10 to study secondary school curriculum. And they were primarily responsible for the system that we know of 8 years of what is now elementary and middle school, primarily elementary and middle school attendance, and then 4 years of high school attendance. In the mid to late 19th century, education began to have much more of a structure. So in 1837, Massachusetts appointed the first Board of Education, and Horace Mann, who later became a congressman and is a very influential name in the field of education, you'll likely hear a lot more about him in your study, became the secretary of that first Board of Education. In 1837, also the first superintendent was appointed in Kentucky. Before this happened, the schools were just run by the local town board, and there was very little organizational structure to the school. In 1839, the first teacher training college called the Normal School opened in Lexington, Massachusetts. So before this, teachers were primarily just um, regular people who were considered had a lot of book learning, and were brought into the town to be a schoolmaster. Primarily men, although women began to creep into that, especially as schools opened on the frontier in the West. But I will say that Mercy College actually opened as a normal school as well. Obviously, not back that far. It opened I believe, in the early 60s as a teacher training college. It was a normal school and then expanded to other types of programs. In 1856, the first kindergarten started in the U.S. in what is now Watertown, Wisconsin. In 1857, the National Teachers Association was formed. We now know it as the National Education Association. In 1867, the Department of Education was created in order to help states establish effective school systems. So a lot more structure going in around the mid-1800s. And in 1874, the Michigan State Supreme Court ruled that Kalamazoo, which was a town, may levy taxes to support a public high school. So what this said is this set the precedent for collecting community taxes to support local schools. In 1905, we had the development of what's called the Carnegie unit. This is a unit that equates seat time with course credits. So right now you're taking this course and it is worth 3 credits, and so that number of credits translates into a certain amount of quote seat time unquote that you're expected to either attend class online or in person. Of course, the late 19th century brought war and devastation throughout the country, but especially in the South. In 1861, the Civil War began, and in 1865, the South surrendered at Appomattox, with General Lee surrendering. But the implication to education was widespread. Much of the South was left in disarray. Homes were burned, schools were shuttered, schools were burned, many of them were closed, and they stayed that way for quite a long time. In 1867, George Peabody funded a $2 million Peabody Education Fund to aid public education in southern states, which did some good, but there was still a lot of need. In 1868, in spite of opposition by southern states, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified. It guaranteed privileges of citizenship, including due process and equal protection under the law, including the right to vote for freed male slaves. Please note at this time that even though voting rights were expanding, it still didn't expand to women. That didn't come along until 1920. So any male could vote at this time. It became the basis for rulings, important educational rulings from the Supreme Court later, such as Brown versus Board of Education. In 1873, there was a small depression, and it caused bank foreclosures, businesses, job loss, and so education took a hit. Southern schools were particularly hit hard, making a bad situation even worse. When you hear today about Southern schools lagging, some of it is a part of this. Even 140, 50 years later, they're still dealing with the repercussions of some of this. In 1877, Reconstruction formally ended as the President Rutherford B. Hayes, removed the last federal troops from the South. So between 1865 and 1877, you had federal troops taking up residence in the South to make sure that the rights guaranteed to freed slaves were being upheld. Once those troops were taken away, the foundation for a system of legal segregation and discrimination was quickly established. So you had Jim Crow laws going in, segregated schools, lesser education for blacks, and especially for poor blacks, and many African Americans fled the South. In the early 20th century, you had a rise of scientific thinking applied to education. So this is when you start to hear about some famous educational theories and theorists. And if you're in adolescent education, you may take a course from me later called Educational Psychology, where we talk about some of these. In 1903, a Russian researcher by the name of Ivan Pavlov came up with an idea of classical conditioning. He did a famous experiment where he paired the sound of a bell with food giving to a dog, and the dog would salivate, and finally he was able to take away the food, and the dog would salivate anyway just on the sound of the bell. That's called classical conditioning, and it led to some theories by another theorist by the name of B.F. Skinner, and that's why we use rewards and punishments in classrooms today. In 1905, Alfred Binet developed the first IQ test that became the foundation for the Stanford Binet. In 1913, a prominent theorist called Edward Thorndike developed the idea of law of effect, which is that actions have consequences. And that's something in school that we use on a daily basis, hour by hour. In 1916, John Dewey, another famous name. You might remember learning about the Dewey Decimal System, the way the books are categorized in the library. John Dewey was a famous education specialist in the early 20th century. He developed an idea about how education could promote democracy and how education was a right of all. He wrote Democracy and Education. In 1916, the Bureau of Educational Experiments was founded in New York City by Lucy Sprague Mitchell with the purpose of studying child development and children's learning, and that eventually became the Bank Street College of Education, a well-known institute today. In 1921, Lewis Terman launched a longitudinal study of intellectually superior children. He wanted to understand the nature of intelligence at Stanford University. The study continued for more than 75 years. He collected all kinds of information on these children. He measured their head size, he measured their relationships, he followed them throughout their whole lives, and then his assistant took over upon his death. It greatly expanded what we know about education and about intelligence. In 1929, Jean Piaget, that's a man, he's a famous theorist, developed a theory of cognitive development. And his idea was that children learn by exploring the environment around them, and they learn in particular stages. And he sequentialized the stages. So we're coming to know more and more about how children learn. And so the focus in this time isn't just on what we're teaching children, but developmentally. How do people learn? How do children learn? In 1966, Jerome Bruner wrote Toward a Theory of Instruction, and his views regarding learning helped to popularize the cognitive learning theory as an alternative to behaviorism. What that means is, before that, we just thought children's brains were black boxes, and you put knowledge in and you gave them a reward and they learned it. And as teachers, we know it's not quite that simple, that children have other reasons to learn or not learn. You have to take into account where they are developmentally, for example. You have to take into account previous experiences. So again, this is a whole field that's growing in the early 20th century. The Great Depression hit hard in 1929, caused stock market crashes. The U.S. economy was devastated. Public education funding suffered greatly, resulting in school closings, teacher layoffs, and lower salaries. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president and began bold efforts to initiate what is called his New Deal to restart the economy. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, became a champion of human rights. In 1935, Congress authorized the Work Progress Administration, and it put thousands of people, unemployed people, to work on building public projects. They built railroads, they built buildings, they built roads. It kept the food on the table, and it made this country's infrastructure much stronger. In World War II, 1941 to 1945 for us, we joined our allies to fight. In 1944, the GI Bill of Rights was signed by Roosevelt. More than 2 million students attended colleges or universities as a result of this bill, nearly doubling the college population. And about 238,000 of those became teachers. So we can thank Roosevelt and some of the people he had around them for a vast boon to education. Because the law provided the same opportunity to every veteran, regardless of background, the long-standing tradition that a college education was only for the wealthy was broken. In 1957, something really important happened. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which was the first satellite to orbit the Earth. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with education? Well, because it occurred in the middle of the Cold War, and that was what we called our conflict with Russia, it represented both a potential threat to American national security as well as a blow to national pride, leading to a reemphasis on education, especially science education. All of a sudden, science education became a big thing in this country. We have to train our children better in science. We have to teach them about science. And there were all types of opportunities offered both during their K to 12 years and after they graduated to go into science and math. In the middle to late 20th century, there was a rising equality that took place. In 1946, um, Congress recognized the need for a permanent legislative basis for school lunch program. So that was the start of the school lunch program. In 1954, this is a landmark decision. In Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. Before this, in the South primarily, you had black schools and you had white schools, and the argument was always, well, they're all just as good as each other, and so it doesn't matter if they go separately. And Brown versus the Board of Education blew that out of the water and said you can't have separate but equal. That's first of all, the black schools were not equal. They were given poorer facilities, outdated textbooks, not as many textbooks, and second of all, the Supreme Court said this is just not just or fair. In 1955, Rosa Parks, you probably know the story, a Montgomery, Alabama seamstress, refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white passenger and was subsequently arrested and fined. The Montgomery bus boycott followed, giving impetus to the civil rights movement. And then a year later, in the case of Browder versus Gale, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregated seating on buses is unconstitutional. So it used to be that when a school bus went around, black students would have to sit in the back of the bus, just like on a public bus, and this was blown apart partly by the actions of Ms. Parks. 1960, Ruby Bridges became the first African American to attend a public elementary school with white students in New Orleans. She became a class of one as parents removed all the white students from the school. In 1963, in response to the large number of Cuban immigrant children arriving in Miami after the Cuban Revolution, Coral Way Elementary School started the first bilingual and bicultural public school in the United States. In 1964, the Association for Children with Learning Disabilities, now the Learning Disabilities Association of America, was formed. Also, the Civil Rights Law became act. And in 1965, as part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, we had funds for the first time to help low-income students, which resulted in the initiation of educational programs such as Title I and bilingual education. So you can see the trend, more education, education for all, and better support for our students. In 1965, we had the establishment of Project Head Start, which was a preschool education program for children from low-income families. In 1968, the Bilingual Education Act was passed, also known as Title VII, and it was replaced in 2002 by the No Child Left Behind Act. In 1972, Title IX was passed that protected women's and girls' participation in sports. In 1975, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act became federal law. It required that a free, appropriate public education suited to the student's individual needs be offered in the least restrictive setting. So think back if you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, and that was set in the 1960s. Forrest would have been classified as a student with disabilities. He had a very low IQ. At that time, Forrest would have been put into a separate school. And if you remember the movie, the mother had to go in and plead with the principal not to do that. If Forrest had been going in after 1975, he would have been put into a regular classroom because that's what we consider the least restrictive environment for his particular situation. In other words, the environment where he can function at the highest, with the lowest number of supports. In the later 20th century, you had a rise of competing forces, partly in reaction to some things that had come before. So, for example, in 1975 in Newsweek, there was a story called Why Johnny Can't Write. And basically, it was a story that came up and said, children today can't write. It's because we've gotten away from the basics and we need to go back to just teaching them how to read and write and do basic math, and then everything will be all right. Well, of course, that was a sort of a simplified, misty, rose-colored glasses looking back at the past that never really actually was, because many children couldn't learn to read or write because they were blocked from education. But nevertheless, there was this competing story that grew up. In 1981, IBM introduced its first personal computer, which would have huge impacts on education. And that hasn't been all that long ago if you think about it. 1982, the U.S. Supreme Court invalidated Louisiana's Creationism Act, which required the teaching of creationism wherever evolution is taught. So the rising idea, the competing ideas of creationism, that God made the earth in 7 days, was a required teaching in Louisiana schools until that time. In 1982, also, the Supreme Court ruled that a Texas law denying public education to undocumented school-aged children violated the Equal Protection Clause. So in 1982, the Supreme Court said undocumented children are entitled to a public school education in the United States. In 1982, also, the Supreme Court found that books cannot be removed from a school library because school administrators deem their content to be offensive. Now, as you can imagine, each of these decisions was controversial, and yet each decision came down on the side of expanding access to education and educational resources to students. In 1983, the National Commission on Excellence in Education published a report called A Nation at Risk, calling for sweeping reforms in public education and teacher training. In 1970s and early 80s, most colleges became coeducational. Many colleges before that were either men's colleges or women's colleges. As a matter of fact, I was among one of the first cohorts of women at my particular university, University of Virginia. Changes started to come about rapidly. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush called together the nation's governors for an educational summit in Charlottesville, Virginia, and set the stage for national standards. Today, we have bodies of national standards that many states emulate or copy. They're not required to adopt them, but for example, there's a set of national science standards. In 1990, those of you who are studying students with disabilities, you'll want to remember this one. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, became law. It's basically a civil rights law for students with disability, prohibiting discrimination against them and guaranteeing a free and adequate public education. In 1991, Minnesota passed the first charter school law. In 1999, unfortunately, we had the first large school shooting, Columbine High School, where 15 were dead and 23 were wounded at Littleton, Colorado. This has become an unfortunately regular occurrence. My thoughts and my heart always go out to the Newtown children at Sandy Hook, those little kindergartners and first graders. In 2001, we had a law that No Child Left Behind. And in 2009, we had Common Core Standards Initiative. And these are the standards that in reading and math that many states follow. So I know we've covered a lot here, but some thoughts that you might want to take away. Education has moved over the years from access for the few, primarily wealthy sons who wanted to go into the clergy, to access for many, to girls, to Hispanics, to blacks, to older people, to younger people. From covering little content, remember those Latin and grammar classic curriculum to lots and lots of content about many things, from little structure uh, to very highly regulated. We have whole organizational structures now to support education. And I would argue also from little controversy to much controversy. When it was pretty clear that it was off the table for most people didn't think about it. Now, because it's state regulated and local community regulated, and people believe different things about education, we usually have a lot of controversy in education. So, knowing the past, what comes next? When you go into teaching, will you be teaching for 30 years or 40 years? What will you see? I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I hope you think about what it means to you in terms of the past into the future.